Sometimes the meanest dog has the gentlest heart, and sometimes the loneliest man needs exactly what everyone else has given up on. For 8 long years, a scarred dog named Bristle drove away every kind soul who tried to help him. He growled and snapped at anyone who came close, earning a reputation as the town's most dangerous stray. But Bristle wasn't mean. He was grieving. Then one winter morning, a lonely mountain man named Ezra found him following his trail through the snow. What Ezra discovered about this dog's past would change everything he thought he knew about loyalty and loss. Bristle had been protecting a secret so heartbreaking that he chose to live alone rather than risk loving again. But what happens when 2 wounded souls finally find the courage to trust? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain town of Cedar Falls had seen its share of hard winters, but none quite like the one that settled in during the autumn of 1962. Snow came early that year, blanketing the pine-covered ridges in October and refusing to let go well into what should have been spring. It was the kind of winter that made folks huddle closer to their fires and speak in hushed tones about things better left alone. Ezra Boone had been living on Timber Ridge for near on 15 years, ever since he'd come back from Korea with more ghosts than a man ought to carry. His cabin sat tucked between towering pines, close enough to town that he could walk down for supplies when needed, but far enough up the mountain that visitors were rare and generally unwelcome. At 52, Ezra had grown comfortable with solitude. His weathered hands knew the rhythm of splitting wood, the careful dance of checking his trap lines, and the quiet satisfaction of a well-tended fire. The town below thought him odd, perhaps even touched in the head. They'd whisper about the hermit up on Timber Ridge who talked to himself and hadn't been seen with another soul in years. What they didn't understand was that Ezra preferred the honest company of wind through pine boughs to the complicated mess of human conversation. Trees didn't ask questions about the war. Mountains didn't require explanations for the way a man's hands sometimes shook when thunder rolled too close to artillery fire. His cabin was a testament to patience and practicality. Built from logs he'd felled and hewn himself, it sat solid against the mountain's shoulder, weathered grey as the rocks around it. Inside, everything had its place. Snowshoes hung by the door, traps oiled and ready on wooden pegs, shelves lined with mason jars full of preserved vegetables from his small garden. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and beside it sat his most prized possession, a wooden rocking chair that had belonged to his grandmother, the only piece of furniture he'd brought from his old life. The chair held memories of evening stories and gentle hands that had smoothed away childhood fears. Sometimes, on the longest nights, Ezra would sit in that chair and remember what it felt like to be part of something larger than the echo of his own footsteps. But those moments passed quickly, replaced by the reliable comfort of routine and the certain knowledge that a man alone couldn't disappoint anyone but himself. Down in Cedar Falls, the townspeople had their own rhythms. Main Street stretched 4 blocks between the Methodist Church on one end and old Pete Garrison's hardware store on the other. In between sat Mabel's Diner, the post office, Hendrick's General Store, and the barber shop where men gathered to solve the world's problems over coffee and complaints about the weather. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and a stranger could be spotted from 3 blocks away. Sheriff Tom Bradley had been keeping the peace in Cedar Falls for 23 years, and in all that time, his biggest problems had been Saturday night drunks and the occasional dispute over property lines. He was a large man, with gentle eyes, and the kind of steady disposition that made people feel safe. Tom had tried more than once to draw Ezra Boone into conversation during his infrequent trips to town. But the mountain man seemed content to conduct his business in silence and disappear back up the ridge like smoke. The one thing that troubled Tom, and indeed most of the town, was the dog. Bristle had appeared in Cedar Falls sometime in the winter of 1954, a medium-sized mutt with a coat that might once have been golden, but had faded to the color of old brass. A jagged scar ran from his left ear down across his muzzle, giving him a perpetually fierce expression. But it wasn't his appearance that kept people at bay, it was his behavior. The dog had taken up residence in the narrow alley between Henderson's store and the barber shop, fashioning himself a shelter from discarded crates and canvas tarps. He survived on scraps thrown his way by soft-hearted souls, but woe to anyone who tried to approach with kindness. Bristle would bare his teeth, hackles rising, and emit a growl so menacing that even the bravest children learned to cross the street when they saw him. Dr. Margaret Sullivan, the town's only veterinarian, had attempted to examine him twice. Both times, Bristle had cornered himself against a wall and snapped with such ferocity that she'd been forced to retreat. "That dog's been hurt bad," she'd told Tom Bradley after her second failed attempt. "Something's broken inside him that goes deeper than flesh and bone." The peculiar thing was, Bristle never actually bit anyone. For all his snarling and carrying on, he seemed content to frighten people away rather than cause real harm. Still, parents warned their children to stay clear, and most adults gave him a wide berth. Only Sarah Mitchell, who ran the bakery, continued to leave him scraps on a regular basis, though she was careful to set them down at a safe distance and retreat before he approached. "Every creature deserves compassion," Sarah would say when folks questioned her charity. "Even the ornery ones. Especially the ornery ones." Sarah was 73, with silver hair she kept pinned in a neat bun, and eyes that had seen enough of life to understand that meanness often grew from hurt. She'd lost her husband in the First War and her only son in the Second, yet somehow managed to greet each day with the kind of gentle determination that made fresh bread and hope seem equally possible. It was Sarah who first noticed that Bristle wore a collar beneath his matted fur, just a glimpse of leather, when he turned his head in a certain light. She'd mentioned it to Tom Bradley, who'd made a note to investigate when the opportunity arose. But opportunities to get close to Bristle were rare and generally ended with the dog's hasty retreat to whatever hidey hole he'd claimed for the day. The winter of 1962 had been particularly hard on everyone, including Bristle. Sarah noticed he'd grown thinner, his ribs showing through his dull coat, despite her faithful offerings of day-old bread and meat scraps. The cold seemed to settle into his bones, making his movements stiff and pained. Yet still, he refused all overtures of help, maintaining his fierce independence even as the snows deepened and the nights grew long. It was during one of these bitter February mornings that Ezra Boone made his monthly trek down to Hendrick's general store for supplies. He moved through town like a shadow, exchanging only the necessary words to conduct his business. His list was always the same: coffee, salt, flour, ammunition for his rifle, and whatever canned goods happened to be on sale. Old man Hendricks had learned not to attempt conversation beyond the basic courtesies. Ezra would nod politely, pay an exact change, and disappear back up the mountain with his provisions loaded into a worn canvas pack. But that particular morning, as Ezra stepped out of the store into the bitter wind, he caught sight of something that made him pause. In the alley across the street, Bristle lay curled against the side of Henderson's building, his body shaking with cold. Snow had drifted around him during the night, and ice crystals clung to his whiskers. The dog's eyes were open, alert as always to any potential threat. But there was something different about him, a weariness that went beyond the effects of a hard winter. For a long moment, man and dog regarded each other across the width of Main Street. Ezra felt an unexpected stirring in his chest, a recognition of something familiar in the animal's stubborn isolation. Here was another creature that had learned to keep the world at bay, to trust in nothing but its own vigilance. Then the wind picked up, swirling snow between them, and Ezra turned away. He had his own survival to consider, his own carefully maintained boundaries to protect. Getting involved with a problem dog would only complicate the simple life he'd worked so hard to build. But as he climbed the mountain path toward home, his pack heavy with supplies, Ezra couldn't shake the image of those watchful eyes. There had been intelligence there, and pain, and something else, a quality he recognized from his own reflection in the cabin's single mirror. It was the look of someone who had learned that caring too much could cost everything. That night, sitting in his grandmother's rocking chair, with the fire crackling before him, Ezra found his thoughts returning again and again to the dog in the alley. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, rattling the cabin's windows and sending snow spiraling past in ghostly sheets. It was the kind of night that made a man grateful for solid walls and a warm hearth. The kind of night that no creature should have to endure alone. But Ezra had endured plenty of such nights himself, and he'd survived. The dog would either find a way to make it through the winter, or he wouldn't. That was the way of things in the mountains. Harsh, perhaps, but honest. Nature didn't soften its lessons for anyone, human or animal. Still, as he banked the fire and prepared for bed, Ezra found himself listening to the wind with unusual attention, wondering if somewhere in its voice he might hear the sounds of a creature in distress. He told himself it was foolishness, this sudden concern for a dog he'd seen only once. He had enough ghosts of his own to tend without adding new ones to the collection, but sleep was slow in coming that night, and when it finally arrived, it brought dreams of dark alleys and watchful eyes, of snow falling endlessly on a world where every living thing learned to fend for itself or perish in the trying. 3 days after their first encounter, Ezra found the dog following him. He'd left the cabin before dawn to check his trap lines, moving through the forest with the quiet efficiency of long practice. The snow was deep but manageable, and his snowshoes carried him steadily along the familiar routes he'd carved through the wilderness over 15 years of mountain living. The morning was crisp and still, with that particular quality of silence that comes only with fresh snowfall. It was at the third trap, a steel-jawed contraption set beside a game trail near Willow Creek, that Ezra first sensed he wasn't alone. The trap was empty, but something had disturbed the snow around it. Bootprints, perhaps, though they seemed too small. He knelt to examine the marks more closely, and that's when he caught the scent dog, recent, and somewhere behind him, the faintest sound of breathing that wasn't his own. Ezra straightened slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. In his peripheral vision, he caught a flash of bronze-colored fur, approximately 50 yards back along his trail. When he turned his head for a direct look, the shape melted behind a cluster of snow-laden pines. "I know you're there," Ezra said quietly, his voice carrying easily in the thin mountain air. "Been following me since the ridge line, haven't you?" No response, but he hadn't expected one. Ezra continued his work, checking the remaining traps with deliberate normalcy while remaining acutely aware of his shadow. The dog, and he was certain now it was Bristle, maintained his distance but never lost the trail. When Ezra paused to reset a sprung trap, he could feel those watchful eyes upon him. When he moved forward, soft paw steps followed in the snow behind. By the time Ezra completed his circuit and turned toward home, nearly 3 hours had passed. His mysterious companion had neither approached nor retreated, maintaining the same careful distance, like a wild thing uncertain whether to flee or investigate further. The behavior puzzled Ezra. In his experience, dogs were either friendly or fearful, social creatures that either sought human company or avoided it entirely. This calculated surveillance was something else entirely. Halfway up the ridge toward his cabin, Ezra made a decision that surprised even him. He stopped beside a fallen log, brushed the snow from its surface, and sat down. From his pack, he withdrew a piece of jerky, part of his midday meal, and placed it on the log beside him. Then he waited. The forest held its breath. Somewhere in the trees behind him, Ezra could sense movement, a shifting of position, as the dog tried to understand this unexpected development. Minutes passed. A jay called from high in the pines. The wind stirred the snow-heavy branches with a sound like whispered secrets. Then, barely audible above the forest's quiet symphony, came the soft crunch of careful footsteps. Ezra kept his eyes fixed ahead, his body relaxed and still. The footsteps approached with agonizing caution, pausing frequently, ready for instant retreat. Closer, closer still. The jerky disappeared from the log with hardly a sound. Ezra allowed himself a small smile, but didn't turn around. After several more minutes, he shouldered his pack and continued up the mountain. The following footsteps resumed, perhaps a bit closer than before. This became their pattern over the following week. Each morning, Ezra would set out to check his traps, and each morning Bristle would appear somewhere along the trail to follow at a distance. The dog's tracking skills were impressive. He moved through the forest with minimal disturbance, reading Ezra's intended route with uncanny accuracy. Sometimes Ezra would catch glimpses of golden fur between the trees. Other times, only the faint sound of breathing or the occasional displaced pebble revealed his companion's presence. And each day, at some point during the journey, Ezra would pause and leave food. Never making a show of it, never turning to watch, simply placing jerky or hardtack somewhere visible and continuing on his way. The offerings always vanished, though Ezra never saw the dog take them. On the seventh day, something changed. Ezra was crouched beside Willow Creek, examining tracks in the mud where the water ran too fast to freeze, when a low growl froze him in place. Not from behind him, where Bristle typically maintained his vigil, but from ahead. The sound was deep and threatening, punctuated by the distinctive snuffling that could only mean one thing: bear. Ezra's blood chilled. A bear this time of year would be hungry, desperate, and unpredictable. Slowly, he reached for the rifle slung across his back, his movements careful and controlled. The growling continued, closer now, and through the trees, he caught sight of a massive dark shape, moving with surprising speed for something that should have been hibernating. The bear emerged from the underbrush 30 yards downstream, a huge black bear, gaunt from winter's hunger, its small eyes fixed on Ezra with predatory intent. It reared up on its hind legs, standing nearly 8 feet tall, and released a roar that echoed off the surrounding ridges. Ezra brought his rifle to bear, knowing even as he did that a clean shot would be difficult from his crouched position. The bear dropped to all fours and charged, covering ground with terrifying speed. Ezra had perhaps 3 seconds to aim, fire, and pray his shot found its mark. That's when Bristle exploded from the tree line. The dog launched himself at the bear's flank with a fury that seemed to double his size. His teeth found purchase in the thick winter fur, and his growls, so familiar from his encounters with the townspeople, now served their true purpose. The bear wheeled in surprise, swiping massive claws at this unexpected attacker. Bristle danced away from the blow, circling, snapping, creating enough chaos and confusion to give Ezra the opening he needed. The rifle shot cracked through the forest like thunder. The bear staggered, wounded but not killed, and turned its rage toward this new threat. Ezra worked the bolt action, chambering another round, but Bristle was already moving again. The dog darted in and out, harrying the massive predator, forcing it to divide its attention between 2 adversaries. The second shot found its mark. The bear collapsed into the snow with a final, shuddering breath. In the sudden silence that followed, man and dog faced each other across the body of their fallen enemy. Both were breathing hard, adrenaline surging through their systems. Bristle's hackles were still raised, his lips pulled back from bared teeth. But for the first time since Ezra had known of his existence, the dog's aggression wasn't directed at him. "Well," Ezra said softly, lowering his rifle. "I reckon I owe you one." Bristle's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. The dog took a tentative step forward, then another. His tail wasn't wagging. Ezra suspected it might be years since this animal had felt safe enough for such displays. But neither was he retreating. "You saved my life. You know that?" Ezra continued, his voice gentle. "That bear would have had me for certain if you hadn't interfered." Another step. Bristle was now close enough that Ezra could see the intelligence in his eyes, the way his head tilted slightly as he processed the unfamiliar experience of being spoken to with kindness rather than fear or frustration. Slowly, carefully, Ezra reached into his pack and withdrew not just a piece of jerky, but the entire remainder of his provisions for the day. Bread, cheese, dried meat, everything he'd brought for his own sustenance. He placed the food on the ground between them and then, in a gesture that surprised them both, stepped back. "Take your time," Ezra said. "We've got all day." For the first time in 8 years, Bristle approached while a human watched. He moved with the careful dignity of a creature testing new waters, ready to flee at the first sign of deception. But when he reached the food, when he lifted his scarred muzzle to meet Ezra's steady gaze, something fundamental shifted between them. The dog's collar was clearly visible now, worn leather with tarnished metal buckles. And there, nearly obscured by the matted fur of his neck, Ezra could make out faded letters stamped into the leather. Not Bristle, as the town had taken to calling him, but something else. Something that spoke of a life before the alley, before the snarling and the solitude. The name was Lucky. As Bristle, Lucky, carefully consumed the offered meal, Ezra found himself wondering what chain of events had transformed a dog named Lucky into the town's most feared stray. What had happened to break this animal's trust so completely that 8 years of kindness from strangers couldn't heal the wound? The afternoon sun was slanting low through the pines by the time they made their way back toward Ezra's cabin. Lucky followed, no longer maintaining his careful distance, but walking close enough that their footsteps fell into a natural rhythm. For the first time in 15 years, Ezra Boone wasn't alone on the mountain. But he understood, with the deep intuition that comes from recognizing kindred spirits, that this was only the beginning. Whatever had broken this dog's trust would not be easily mended. The real work, the patient, careful business of rebuilding faith between damaged souls, was just beginning. The first night Lucky spent at Ezra's cabin was a careful dance of boundaries and tentative trust. Ezra had fashioned a bed from old blankets near the fireplace, far enough from his own sleeping area to give the dog space, but close enough to the warmth to keep the mountain cold at bay. Lucky approached the makeshift bed with the same caution he'd shown all day, sniffing the fabric thoroughly before settling down with his back to the wall and his eyes fixed on the cabin's single door. "Smart," Ezra murmured from his own bed across the room. "Always keep your escape route in sight. I've lived by that rule myself for more years than I care to count." Lucky's ears swiveled toward the sound of his voice, but he didn't lift his head. The dog maintained his vigilant posture, even as exhaustion clearly weighed on his frame. Every small sound, the settling of logs in the fireplace, the creak of wind-bent pines outside, caused his muscles to tense, ready for flight or fight. Ezra understood. He'd spent his own first months in this cabin sleeping with one hand on his rifle, starting awake at every unfamiliar noise. The war had left him with nerves strung tight as piano wire, and only years of mountain solitude had taught him to find peace in the darkness. This dog carried his own war wounds, invisible but no less real. The next morning brought new challenges. Lucky accepted food from Ezra's hand, a small miracle in itself, but when Ezra moved to examine the collar more closely, the dog's lips pulled back in warning. Not the vicious snarl he'd shown townspeople, but a clear message nonetheless. Some boundaries remained inviolate. "All right then," Ezra said, settling back. "We'll take our time. No sense rushing what's been 8 years in the making." Their second day together fell into a pattern of small discoveries. Lucky followed Ezra on his trap rounds, but now walked openly beside him rather than skulking in the shadows. The dog's gait was stiff, favoring his left rear leg, an old injury that the cold weather aggravated. When they paused by Willow Creek, Lucky drank deeply from the running water, and Ezra noticed how the animal's ribs showed through his dull coat, despite yesterday's generous meal. "You've been living rough for a long time, haven't you, boy?" Ezra observed. "Longer than anyone should have to." That evening, as they sat by the fire, Ezra began to talk. Not the stilted conversation he might attempt with townspeople, but the kind of steady, one-sided dialogue he'd carried on with the mountains themselves during his loneliest years. "I came up here after Korea," he said, "watching the flames dance in the stone hearth. Figured I'd had enough of people for one lifetime. Funny thing about war. It shows you what folks are capable of, both the noble and the terrible. Sometimes I think the worst part wasn't what the enemy did to us, but what we learned we could do to them. Lucky's breathing had grown steady and deep, but his eyes remained open, fixed on Ezra's face, with an attention that seemed almost human in its intensity. "Built this cabin with my own hands," Ezra continued. "Every log, every chink, every nail. Thought if I could make something solid and permanent, maybe I could build some peace into my own bones. Took me 3 years to sleep through the night without jumping at shadows." A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. Lucky's head lifted at the sound, then settled back down when no threat materialized. "You know what I think?" Ezra said softly. "I think you've been carrying your own war around all these years. Something happened to you, something that taught you the world wasn't safe. Made you decide it was better to drive people away than risk getting hurt again." Lucky's tail twitched, not quite a wag, but perhaps the ghost of one. The third day brought unexpected visitors. Ezra was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard the distant sound of voices on the mountain path. Lucky, who had been dozing in a patch of morning sunlight, sprang to his feet with hackles raised. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. The tentatively trusting companion of the past 2 days vanished, replaced by the snarling, aggressive animal the town knew and feared. "Easy," Ezra said quietly. But Lucky was already backing toward the tree line. His lips curled back from bared teeth. Sheriff Tom Bradley emerged from the pines, breathing hard from the climb, followed by Dr. Margaret Sullivan carrying her veterinary bag. Both stopped short when they saw Lucky, the doctor instinctively reaching for Tom's arm. "Ezra," Tom called, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "Heard you might have taken in that stray dog from town. Wanted to check and make sure everything was all right." "Dog's fine," Ezra replied, setting down his axe. "We're getting along well enough." "That animal is dangerous," Dr. Sullivan said, eyeing Lucky's aggressive posture. "He's shown nothing but hostility toward every person who's tried to help him. I'd strongly recommend—" Lucky's growl cut through her words like a blade. The sound was low and menacing, filled with 8 years of accumulated fury and pain. Both visitors took an involuntary step backward. "He's not dangerous," Ezra said firmly. "He's scared. There's a difference, though I suppose it's hard to see when you're looking at those teeth." "Ezra, be reasonable," Tom said. "This dog has terrorized half the town. Kids cross the street to avoid him. Nobody can get within 10 feet without risking a bite. Have you ever actually seen him bite anyone?" Ezra asked. The question hung in the mountain air. Tom and Dr. Sullivan exchanged glances. "Well, no," Tom admitted. "But the aggression is all show," Ezra finished. Fear dressed up to look like anger. "This dog doesn't want to hurt anybody. He just wants to be left alone." Lucky had retreated to the edge of the clearing, his body coiled for flight, but his eyes never leaving the intruders. Ezra could see the war being fought behind those intelligent eyes, the desire to run warring with something else, something new. Trust, perhaps, in the man who had fed him and spoken to him with kindness. "I appreciate your concern," Ezra said, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. "But Lucky and I will work things out in our own time." "Lucky?" Dr. Sullivan asked, surprised. Ezra gestured toward the dog's collar. "Name on his tag." Whoever he belonged to before called him Lucky. The revelation seemed to settle something in both visitors. A dog with a name, with a past, was somehow more than just a dangerous stray. He was someone's loss, someone's grief given teeth and claws. "If you change your mind," Tom said finally. "Or if there's any trouble, there won't be," Ezra said with quiet certainty. After the visitors left, it took nearly an hour for Lucky to emerge from the tree line. When he finally approached the cabin, his movements were stiff with residual tension. Ezra was waiting on the front porch, a bowl of fresh water beside him. "They meant well," Ezra said as Lucky cautiously drank. "Most people do, even when they don't understand what they're looking at." Lucky finished drinking and settled beside the porch steps, close enough to Ezra to feel his presence, but positioned for a quick escape if needed. It was progress, of a sort. The dog had chosen to return rather than disappear into the wilderness. That night, as they sat by the fire again, Ezra found himself studying the collar more carefully. The leather was old and worn, the metal fittings tarnished with age. There were other markings besides the name, scratches and scars that spoke of a hard life, of brambles and rough use. But beneath the damage, he could make out what looked like an address, the letters so faded they were barely legible. Cedar Falls, he was almost certain, and numbers that might be a street address. Someone in town had loved this dog once. Someone had given him the name Lucky and fitted him with a collar and considered him family. The question that haunted Ezra as he drifted off to sleep was simple but profound. What had happened to drive them apart? The mystery of Lucky's past began to consume Ezra's thoughts in ways he hadn't expected. For 15 years, he'd lived contentedly without puzzles to solve or questions that demanded answers. His world had been reduced to the basic necessities of survival: food, shelter, warmth, safety. But now, watching Lucky flinch at sudden sounds or wake from sleep with a start, Ezra found himself hungry for understanding. A week after the sheriff's visit, Ezra made a decision that surprised even him. He would go into town and ask questions. The prospect filled him with dread. Cedar Falls represented everything he'd fled after the war: curious eyes, well-meaning questions, the exhausting pretense of normalcy. But Lucky deserved better than a life built on fear and suspicion. If there were answers to be found about the dog's past, Ezra would find them. "Stay close to the cabin," he told Lucky as he prepared for the journey down the mountain. "I'll be back before dark." Lucky watched from the porch as Ezra shouldered his pack, those intelligent eyes seeming to understand that this departure was different from the routine trap checks. When Ezra reached the tree line and looked back, the dog was still sitting exactly where he'd left him, as faithful as any promise. The walk to town gave Ezra time to plan his approach. Direct questions would raise suspicions about his sudden interest in the dog's history. Better to let conversations flow naturally, to listen more than he spoke. Sarah Mitchell at the bakery seemed his best starting point. She'd been feeding Lucky for years and might remember details others had forgotten. The bell above Sarah's door chimed as Ezra entered, and the elderly woman looked up from her work with genuine surprise. In all his years of coming to town for supplies, he never once entered her shop. "Ezra Boone," she said warmly, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "What a pleasant surprise. What can I do for you?" "Heard you make the finest apple pie in 3 counties, Ezra said, the social lie coming easier than expected. "Thought I might try a slice." Sarah's face lit up with pleasure. She cut him a generous portion and poured coffee without being asked, settling into the chair across from him with the easy familiarity of someone who understood loneliness. "How are you managing up on the ridge?" she asked. "This winter's been harder than most. Getting by well enough," Ezra replied. "Actually, I've got some company now. That dog from the alley, Lucky. He's taken up residence at my place." Sarah's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That old boy followed you home?" "Well, I'll be. They've been leaving him scraps for years, but he never let anyone get close." "How on earth did you manage it?" "Patience, mostly. And we helped each other out of a tight spot with a bear." Ezra took a bite of pie, buying time to frame his next question carefully. "You know anything about where he came from originally? That collar he wears looks like it's seen some years." Sarah's expression grew thoughtful, and she was quiet for so long that Ezra wondered if he'd pushed too hard. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft with old sadness. "There was a family," she said slowly. "The Hendersons, no relation to the store Hendersons. They lived on Maple Street, in a little white house with blue shutters. Jim Henderson worked at the sawmill, and his wife Ellen taught school. They had 2 children, a boy named Michael who would be grown now, and a little girl named Annie." Ezra felt something cold settle in his stomach. Sarah's use of the past tense spoke volumes. "They had a dog," Sarah continued. "Golden retriever mix, friendly as the day is long. Used to walk the children to school every morning, wait for them in the afternoon. Ellen called him Lucky, because she said he brought nothing but good fortune to their house. What happened to them? Ezra asked quietly. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. House fire. December of 1954, just before Christmas. Started in the kitchen chimney, they think. Spread so fast there wasn't time to... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. The winter Lucky had first appeared in town. The way he'd flinched from fire in Ezra's cabin those first few nights. The collar bearing a Cedar Falls address that no longer existed. The whole family, Ezra managed. Jim and Ellen, yes. The children were staying at Ellen's sister's house that night. She lived over in Millfield. They'd gone to visit for the weekend. Sarah wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron. Those poor children lost everything. Their parents, their home, their dog. Lucky disappeared that night and nobody saw him for months. When he finally showed up in town, he was half wild and wanted nothing to do with people. The weight of understanding settled on Ezra's shoulders like a stone. Lucky hadn't been abandoned or mistreated by cruel owners. He'd watched his family die, had failed to save them despite all his loyalty and love. The aggression, the isolation, the refusal to let anyone close. It wasn't just fear. It was guilt. The children, Ezra said. What became of them? Michael and Annie went to live with their aunt in Millfield. Last I heard, Michael joined the army right out of high school. Annie, she'd be in her 20s now, moved to California, I think. Neither of them ever came back to Cedar Falls. Too many painful memories. Ezra finished his pie in thoughtful silence, processing this revelation. Lucky had spent 8 years blaming himself for a tragedy no dog could have prevented. 8 years driving away anyone who might care about him because caring had led to such terrible loss. Thank you for the pie, Ezra said finally, leaving money on the table. And for the story. I'll take good care of him. Sarah smiled through her tears. I believe you will. That dog's been waiting a long time for someone who understands. The walk back up the mountain seemed longer than usual, each step carrying Ezra deeper into contemplation. He thought about the weight of survivor's guilt, the way it could twist a soul into shapes never intended by nature. He'd carried his own version of it home from Korea, the knowledge that he'd lived while better men had died. That chance and luck had spared him from the fate of his brothers in arms. Lucky was waiting exactly where Ezra had left him. But the dog's relief at his return was visible in every line of his body. His tail gave a tentative wag, and he followed Ezra into the cabin with steps that seemed lighter than before. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Ezra spoke the truth aloud for the first time. I know what happened to your family. Lucky, I know about the fire, and I know you think it was somehow your fault. Lucky's head lifted sharply, his eyes wide with something that might have been recognition. But it wasn't, Ezra continued gently. Sometimes terrible things happen, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop them. Not you, not me, not the bravest dog who ever lived. For the first time since he'd been at the cabin, Lucky moved closer to Ezra's chair. Not quite within arm's reach, but closer than he'd ever been. It was a small step, but Ezra understood its significance. Healing, he realized, wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about learning to carry it without letting it crush you. Both he and Lucky had work to do in that regard. But perhaps they could do it together. Outside, the wind sang through the pines with a sound like forgiveness. And for the first time in years, neither man nor dog felt quite so alone with their ghosts. The revelation about Lucky's past changed everything and nothing at the same time. The dog's behavior remained largely the same, cautious, alert, ready for flight at the first sign of danger. But now Ezra understood the weight behind those watchful eyes, the careful distance Lucky maintained even in moments of apparent relaxation. March brought the first hints of spring to Timber Ridge, though snow still clung to the shadowed hollows and ice glazed the creek each morning. The days grew longer, and with them came new routines. Lucky had begun to anticipate Ezra's movements, positioning himself by the door when trap-checking time approached. Following the familiar paths with increasing confidence, it was during one of these morning excursions that they encountered. Their first real test since the sheriff's visit, Ezra was examining a trap near the old logging road when he heard the distant rumble of an engine. Vehicles were rare this far up the mountain, and his first instinct was to gather Lucky and retreat into the forest until the intruders passed. But Lucky's reaction was immediate and extreme. The dog bolted for the nearest thicket, his entire body trembling with terror that went far beyond his usual wariness. The pickup truck that rounded the bend was ancient and battered, its exhaust pipe trailing blue smoke. Behind the wheel sat Cal Brennan, a local handyman known more for his drinking than his reliability. In the truck bed, Ezra could see the glint of metal, steel traps, hunting gear, and what looked like a makeshift cage. Cal spotted Ezra and pulled over, his engine coughing to a stop. "Morning, Boone," he called, climbing out with the unsteady movements of a man who'd started drinking early. "Heard you got yourself a dog up here." "That's right," Ezra replied carefully, noting how Lucky had pressed himself deeper into the undergrowth at the sound of Cal's voice. "Thing is," Cal continued, swaying slightly, "that dog's been causing problems in town for years. Sheriff asked me to come up and take care of the situation. Got a cage in the truck and everything." Ezra felt his jaw tighten. "Sheriff Bradley never mentioned anything about removing Lucky when he visited last week." "Well, maybe he figured you'd come to your senses on your own." Cal's eyes were bloodshot and mean. "But seeing as how you haven't, I'm here to collect that animal. Town council voted. That dog's a public menace." The lie was obvious, but Cal was drunk enough to believe his own story. He moved toward the thicket where Lucky was hiding, and Ezra stepped into his path. "The dog stays with me," Ezra said quietly. "Now listen here, Boone. No, you listen." Ezra's voice carried the kind of authority he'd learned in the army. Calm, but absolutely final. "That dog is on my property, under my protection. You'll turn around and drive back down this mountain, and you'll do it now." Cal's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "You can't." "I can, and I will." Ezra moved closer, and something in his posture made Cal take an involuntary step backward. "You're trespassing on private land, carrying what appears to be stolen traps, and threatening to take my property. I suggest you leave while you still can." For a moment, the two men faced each other in the morning sunlight. Cal was larger and younger, but Ezra carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced down worse threats than a drunk with delusions of authority. Finally, Cal spat in the dirt and stalked back to his truck. "This ain't over," he called as the engine coughed to life. "Town's got rights, and that dog's a danger to everyone." The truck disappeared down the mountain in a cloud of smoke and grinding gears, but Lucky remained hidden long after the sound faded. When he finally emerged, his movements were stilted with residual fear. "You know him, don't you?" Ezra said softly. "Cal Brennan, what did he do to you?" Lucky couldn't answer, of course, but his behavior that afternoon spoke volumes. He stayed close to Ezra's side, flinching at every unexpected sound, and that night he refused to settle by the fire, choosing instead to position himself where he could watch both the door and the windows simultaneously. 2 days later, Sarah Mitchell provided the missing pieces of the puzzle. Ezra had returned to the bakery under the pretense of buying bread, but his real purpose was to learn more about the aftermath of the Henderson fire. Sarah welcomed him warmly, and once again they found themselves talking over coffee and pastry. "You mentioned the other day that Lucky disappeared after the fire," Ezra said carefully. "Do you know what happened during those months he was missing?" Sarah's expression darkened. "Oh, that poor creature went through hell from what I heard. Cal Brennan caught him in a trap, said he was going to turn him in for the bounty the county was offering on strays. Kept him caged behind his place for weeks, barely fed him, used him for target practice with rocks and such." Ezra's hands clenched involuntarily.
"Target practice?"
Cal was worse back then. Drank more, if you can imagine such a thing. Had a mean streak a mile wide, especially when it came to animals. Lucky finally got loose one night during a storm, but by then the damage was done. That dog learned to associate humans with pain and captivity. The pieces of Lucky's story were falling into place with horrible clarity. First the trauma of watching his family die, then months of abuse at the hands of someone who should have shown compassion. No wonder the dog had spent 8 years keeping the world at bay. Did anyone try to stop it? Ezra asked. Sheriff tried when he found out. But Cal claimed the dog was dangerous, said he was protecting the community. By the time Tom could investigate properly, Lucky had escaped and disappeared into the woods. Took months before he showed up in town again, and by then he was the snarling, aggressive animal everyone learned to fear. That evening, Ezra sat on his porch, whittling a piece of pine, while Lucky dozed nearby in the fading sunlight. The simple domestic scene felt precious after the day's revelations. A small island of peace in a world that had shown this dog too much cruelty. "I'm sorry," Ezra said quietly, not looking up from his carving. "Sorry for what that man did to you. Sorry for all the fear you've had to carry. But I want you to know something. As long as you're here with me, nobody's going to hurt you again. That's a promise." Lucky's tail stirred against the wooden planks. A subtle acknowledgement that perhaps, just perhaps, promises were things that could be trusted. The next morning brought unexpected visitors once again. But this time, Ezra was prepared. He'd seen the dust cloud on the mountain road and had positioned himself on the porch with his rifle. Across his knees by the time Sheriff Bradley's official vehicle pulled into the clearing, Tom Bradley climbed out alone, his movements careful and non-threatening. "Morning, Ezra. Mind if we talk?" "Depends on what about," Ezra replied. "Cal Brennan came to see me yesterday. Made some wild claims about you threatening him, about the dog being dangerous." Tom paused, studying Ezra's face. "I want to tell me your side of the story?" Ezra related the encounter honestly, watching as Tom's expression grew increasingly grim. When he finished, the sheriff was quiet for a long moment. "Cal's been a problem for years," Tom said finally. "Drinks made him worse than usual lately. I didn't send him up here, Ezra. Whatever he told you was a lie. Figured as much. That said, I am concerned about the dog. Not because I think he's dangerous, but because I think he might be in danger. Cal's not the type to let a grudge go, especially when he's been embarrassed." Lucky had been watching from the cabin doorway, and at the mention of danger, his ears flattened against his skull. Ezra felt a protective anger rise in his chest, an emotion he hadn't experienced in years. "What are you suggesting?" Ezra asked. "Keep your eyes open. Maybe consider coming down to town more often. Let people see that the dog's not the monster they've made him out to be. Sometimes the best protection is proof that the fear was never justified in the first place." After the sheriff left, Ezra found himself contemplating a possibility that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. Taking Lucky to town meant risking everything they'd built together. The fragile trust, the slowly healing wounds, the safe haven they'd created on the mountain. But it also meant the chance for something more. Redemption, acceptance, perhaps even peace. The decision, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. Lucky had saved his life once, had trusted him with secrets too painful for words. Now it was Ezra's turn to take a leap of faith. They would go to town together, man and dog, and face whatever came with the quiet courage that both had learned in their separate battles with the world. The decision to bring Lucky to town required weeks of preparation. Ezra understood that for the dog, Cedar Falls wasn't just a place. It was a collection of painful memories wrapped in the scents and sounds of trauma. Every step down the mountain would be a choice between trust and terror. They started small. Each morning, instead of heading directly to the trap lines, Ezra would guide their walk closer to the road that led to town. Lucky's anxiety was palpable at first, his hackles rising at the distant sound of traffic, his body tensing with the urge to flee. But Ezra's patient presence provided an anchor, a steady voice in the chaos of memory. "Easy, boy," Ezra would murmur when Lucky froze at some half-remembered sound. "We're just walking." Nothing more than that. Gradually, they extended their range. A quarter-mile down the mountain road, then a half-mile. Lucky's confidence grew in increments so small they were barely measurable. But Ezra had learned the value of patience from his own long healing. It was during one of these exploratory walks that they encountered Dr. Margaret Sullivan on her way up the mountain. Her car rounded the bend slowly, and she pulled over when she saw them, rolling down her window with obvious curiosity. Lucky immediately positioned himself behind Ezra, not fleeing, but clearly ready to do so at the first sign of threat. "Ezra," Dr. Sullivan called softly, "I see you've made remarkable progress with him." "He's made the progress," Ezra replied. "I just provided the space for it." Dr. Sullivan studied Lucky with professional interest, noting how the dog's posture had changed since their last encounter. Still alert, still cautious, but no longer radiating the aggressive desperation that had marked their previous meetings. "I owe you an apology," she said. "And perhaps I owe him one as well. I looked at his behavior and saw only the symptoms, not the cause. Most folks do," Ezra said without judgment. "Pain tends to disguise itself as anger when it doesn't know where else to go." "Would you?" Dr. Sullivan hesitated, then seemed to find her resolve. "Would you allow me to examine him? I promise to go slowly, to respect his boundaries. But I'd like to check that old leg injury, make sure he's not in unnecessary discomfort." Lucky's ears flattened at the suggestion, and for a moment Ezra thought they'd lost all their progress. But then, surprisingly, the dog took a small step forward, not toward Dr. Sullivan, but positioning himself where he could see both her and Ezra clearly, a position of watchful tolerance rather than defensive aggression. "What do you think, Lucky?" Ezra asked quietly. "She's trying to help." The examination took place in stages, with Dr. Sullivan moving with the careful patience of someone who understood fear. She spoke softly to Lucky throughout, explaining her movements, allowing him to sniff her hands before she touched him. When she finally palpated the old injury in his rear leg, Lucky winced but didn't pull away. "Healed fracture," she diagnosed. "Probably happened when he was young, set incorrectly. It's causing some arthritis, but nothing that can't be managed with proper care." She looked up at Ezra. "You've been good medicine for him. Better than anything I could prescribe." After she left, Lucky seemed different, not dramatically but in subtle ways that spoke of another small barrier falling. He walked closer to Ezra on their way back to the cabin, and that evening he settled by the fire without his usual careful positioning for escape. The real test came on a grey morning in early April, when Ezra made the announcement that would change everything. "Today we're going to town," he said simply, checking his rifle and shouldering his supply pack. "Together," Lucky understood immediately. His body went rigid, his breathing shallow. For a long moment, Ezra thought the dog might bolt for the forest and not return. Instead, Lucky sat down heavily and looked at Ezra with eyes that seemed to ask a single, heartbreaking question. "Why?" "Because hiding isn't living," Ezra said gently. "I've spent 15 years up here learning that lesson. You've spent 8 years in that alley learning the same thing. Maybe it's time we both tried something different." The walk down the mountain was the longest mile either of them had ever traveled. Lucky stayed close to Ezra's side, his movements careful and controlled, but his tension was visible in every line of his body. Twice he stopped completely, overwhelmed by scents and memories that rose from the approaching town like ghosts. "We can turn back," Ezra offered each time. No shame in that, but Lucky, with a courage that humbled his human companion, pressed forward. The outskirts of Cedar Falls appeared through the trees like a collection of toys scattered by a giant child. Lucky's breathing became labored, not from exertion, but from the weight of returning to a place that held nothing but pain. Yet he continued walking, one careful step at a time. Their first stop was intentionally chosen, Sarah Mitchell's bakery, where the scent of fresh bread and the warmth of genuine kindness might provide a gentler reintroduction to human society. Sarah's reaction when they entered was worth every difficult step of the journey. Her face lit with pure joy as she took in the sight of Lucky walking calmly beside Ezra. No longer the snarling, desperate creature she'd fed from a distance for so many years. "Oh my," she breathed, coming around the counter slowly so as not to startle him. "Look at you, dear one. Look how far you've come." Lucky's tail gave a tentative wag, the first Ezra had seen since the dog had been at the cabin. It was a small thing, barely a flutter, but Sarah noticed it and smiled as if she'd witnessed a miracle. "Would you like to try giving him something?" Ezra suggested, pulling a piece of jerky from his pocket. Sarah took the offering with hands that trembled slightly, whether from age or emotion, Ezra couldn't tell. She knelt slowly, holding the treat at arm's length, and spoke in the gentle voice she'd probably used with countless frightened children over the years. "Hello, Lucky, I'm Sarah. I've been hoping to meet you properly for such a long time." Lucky approached with infinite caution, his nose twitching as he processed the complex mixture of scents, flour and sugar and vanilla, but underneath it all, the honest smell of someone who had shown him kindness, even when he couldn't accept it. He took the jerky from her fingers with the gentleness of a creature who remembered, somewhere beneath all the fear and pain, what it meant to be loved. "There's a good boy," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "There's my brave good boy." The scene attracted attention from passers-by, and soon a small crowd had gathered outside the bakery windows. But instead of the hostile stares Ezra had expected, he saw curious faces, surprised expressions, and more than a few smiles. The town's monster had been revealed as nothing more than a frightened animal who'd finally found someone willing to understand his pain. Word spread quickly through Cedar Falls, as word tends to do in small towns. By the time Ezra and Lucky made their way to Henderson's store for supplies, half the population knew about the transformation taking place in their midst. The walk home up the mountain felt different, lighter somehow, as if both man and dog had shed burdens they'd carried for too long. Lucky's gait was easier, his head held higher. He'd faced his demons and discovered they were smaller than his courage that night. For the first time since he'd arrived at the cabin, Lucky chose to sleep directly beside Ezra's bed, rather than maintaining his careful distance by the door. It was a gesture of trust so complete that Ezra felt his throat tighten with emotion he'd thought himself incapable of feeling. "We did good today," he said softly into the darkness. "Both of us." Lucky's contented sigh was the only answer needed. Outside, the mountain wind sang through the pines, but inside the cabin, two souls who had learned to carry their scars with dignity finally rested in the peace they'd both been seeking for so very long. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late April, carried up the mountain by a postal worker who'd never ventured so far from town before. Ezra found it tucked under a stone by his door when he returned from checking traps. Lucky trotting contentedly beside him in the spring sunshine, the envelope was crisp and official. Bearing the return address of a law firm in California, Ezra studied it with the same wariness he'd once reserved for unfamiliar sounds in the Korean countryside. In his experience, official correspondence rarely brought good news. Inside the cabin, with Lucky settled by the fire, Ezra carefully opened the letter. The letterhead read, "Morrison, Daniels and Associates, Attorneys at Law," and the contents made his blood run cold. "Dear Mr. Boone, we represent our client, Miss Ann Henderson Williams, in a matter concerning a dog currently in your possession. Our client has reason to believe this animal was stolen from her family property following a fire in Cedar Falls, Montana in December 1954. Ms. Henderson Williams has recently learned of the dog's whereabouts and wishes to reclaim her deceased family's pet. As the sole surviving heir to the Henderson estate, she has legal standing to recover any property that belonged to her parents. We have been authorized to offer compensation for any expenses you have incurred in caring for the animal. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange transfer of custody. Sincerely, Robert P. Morrison." Ezra read the letter 3 times, each reading bringing a deeper sense of dread. Annie Henderson, the little girl who'd been staying at her aunt's house the night of the fire, who'd lost everything in a single terrible night, was now a grown woman in California, and she wanted Lucky back. The legal claim was probably valid. Lucky had belonged to the Henderson family, and if Annie was indeed the sole heir, she had rights that transcended the bond Ezra had formed with the dog. But the thought of separating Lucky from the life they'd built together, of sending him away to live with a stranger who bore the face of his lost family, filled Ezra with a panic he hadn't felt since the war. Lucky sensed his distress immediately. The dog lifted his head from his paws, ears pricked with concern, and moved closer to Ezra's chair. His presence was comfort and torment in equal measure, a reminder of everything that might soon be lost. "What am I supposed to do, boy?" Ezra asked softly, his voice thick with emotion. "She has every right to claim you. You were her family's dog long before you were mine." The next few days passed in a haze of indecision. Ezra found himself studying Lucky with new intensity, memorizing the way the dog's ears tilted when he was listening, the careful grace of his movements, the trusting warmth in his eyes when they sat by the fire each evening. Every moment felt precious and finite. He considered ignoring the letter, pretending it had never arrived. Who would know? But Ezra's conscience, tempered by years of military discipline and mountain honesty, wouldn't allow such deception. If Lucky had a chance to reunite with someone who'd loved him before the fire, before the pain and fear and years of loneliness, didn't he deserve that opportunity? On Friday morning, Ezra made the hardest decision of his life. He would call the lawyers and arrange to speak with Annie Henderson Williams directly. If she truly wanted Lucky, if she could provide him with the love and care he deserved, then Ezra would find the strength to let him go. The call to California was arranged through the Cedar Falls post office, where old Pete Garrison allowed Ezra to use the phone in exchange for help unloading a delivery truck. Standing in the dusty back room surrounded by mail sacks and packages, Ezra dialed the number with fingers that trembled like autumn leaves. The voice that answered was soft and familiar, in ways that made his chest ache. "Mr. Boone, this is Annie Henderson Williams. Thank you so much for calling. I can't tell you how much it means to know that Lucky is alive and well." "Ma'am," Ezra began, then stopped. "How did you explain 8 years of pain and healing to someone who'd lost everything in a single night? Your dog, Lucky, he's been through a lot since the fire. He's not the same animal your family knew." "I understand," Annie said gently. "I've spoken with people in Cedar Falls, learned about what happened to him after that night. I know he was hurt both physically and emotionally. That's exactly why I need to see him again. I don't follow, Mum." There was a long pause, and when Annie spoke again, her voice was thick with tears. "Mr. Boone, I've spent 17 years believing that Lucky died in the fire with my parents. 17 years, carrying the guilt that we'd left him behind when we went to visit my aunt. Learning that he's alive, that he survived, it's like getting a piece of my family back." The pain in her voice was genuine, and Ezra felt his resolve wavering. But something nagged at him, a discrepancy he couldn't quite identify. "How did you find out he was still alive?" Ezra asked. "A friend from Cedar Falls saw the story in the local newspaper about how you'd tamed the aggressive dog that had been living in town. She recognized the description and sent me the clipping. When I saw the name Lucky mentioned in the article, I knew it had to be him." Ezra frowned. There had been no newspaper article about Lucky's transformation. The Cedar Falls Gazette barely had the budget for local news, and certainly wouldn't have covered something as minor as a dog finding a home. "Ma'am, I think there might be some confusion. Please—" "Mr. Boone," Annie interrupted, her voice taking on a note of desperation. "I know this must be difficult for you. I can tell from how people describe you that you care about Lucky deeply. But surely you can understand what it would mean to me to have him back. He's the last connection I have to my childhood, to my parents." The emotional manipulation was subtle but unmistakable. Annie wasn't lying about being the Henderson daughter, but something about her story didn't align with what Ezra knew to be true. His instincts, honed by years of military service and mountain living, were sending warning signals he couldn't ignore. "I'll need some time to think about this," Ezra said carefully. "Of course, but please don't take too long. I've already made arrangements to fly to Montana next week. I've waited 17 years to see Lucky again. I don't think I can wait much longer." After hanging up, Ezra sat in the post office parking lot for nearly an hour, trying to sort through his conflicted emotions. Annie's claim seemed legitimate on the surface, but the discrepancies in her story troubled him. More importantly, Something deep in his gut told him that taking Lucky away from the life they'd built together would be a mistake of tragic proportions. The drive back up the mountain gave him time to think. By the time he reached the cabin, Ezra had made a decision that surprised even him. He would investigate Annie Henderson Williams before making any commitment about Lucky's future. That evening, he made another call, this time to Sheriff Bradley. "Tom, I need a favor. Can you help me track down some information about the Henderson family, specifically what happened to the children after the fire?" "Sure thing, Ezra. Mind me asking why?" Ezra explained about the letter and the phone call, sharing his concerns about the inconsistencies in Annie's story. Tom listened with the careful attention of a lawman who'd learned to trust his instincts. "I'll make some calls," Tom promised. "Give me a couple days to dig around. In the meantime, don't do anything hasty. Something about this doesn't smell right to me either." That night, as Lucky slept peacefully beside his bed, Ezra stared at the ceiling and wrestled with possibilities that made his stomach churn. What if Annie wasn't who she claimed to be? What if someone was using the Henderson family tragedy for their own purposes? And if that were true, what kind of danger might Lucky be in? The next morning brought an unexpected visitor that would change everything. Dr. Margaret Sullivan arrived at the cabin just after sunrise, her face grim with news that made Ezra's blood run cold. "Ezra," she said without preamble, "I think you need to know something about the woman who's been calling around town asking questions about Lucky. Her name might be Annie Henderson Williams, but she's not alone. She's traveling with a man who matches Cal Brennan's description of someone who's been asking about hunting dogs for sale." The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place with terrifying clarity. This wasn't about a lost family pet finding his way home. This was about something far more sinister, and Lucky was walking straight into a trap that neither of them had seen coming. The real plot twist wasn't that Annie wanted Lucky back. It was that she might not be Annie at all. And if Ezra was right about what was really happening, then the life they'd built together on Timber Ridge was about to become a battleground where more than just trust would be tested. It would be a fight for survival itself. The revelation that Annie Henderson Williams might not be who she claimed transformed Ezra's mountain sanctuary into a strategic position under potential siege. Years of military training, dormant since Korea, awakened in his mind like sleeping wolves stirring at the scent of danger. "Tell me everything," Ezra said to Dr. Sullivan as they sat at his kitchen table. Lucky pressed against his leg with an alertness that suggested the dog sensed the changing atmosphere. "Tom Bradley called me after you spoke with him yesterday," Dr. Sullivan explained, a veterinarian's steady hands betraying only the slightest tremor. "He'd been making inquiries about the Henderson children, and what he found doesn't match the story you were told." She pulled a manila folder from her bag, spreading several documents across the worn wooden surface. "Michael Henderson, the son, died in Vietnam in 1968. Ann Henderson, she never married, never took the name Williams, died in a car accident in Sacramento 3 years ago. There is no surviving Henderson family member." The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. Lucky whined softly, pressing closer as if trying to share whatever burden his human companion was carrying. "Then who? We don't know yet. But Tom did some checking with airlines and rental car companies. A woman calling herself Ann Henderson Williams flew into Missoula 2 days ago, accompanied by a man named Carl Brenner." "Sound familiar?" Ezra's jaw tightened. "Cal Brennan's been using aliases now, apparently. And here's the thing that should worry us most. They rented a van equipped with animal transport cages. Professional grade, the kind used for large, potentially dangerous dogs." The implications crashed over Ezra like an avalanche. This wasn't about reuniting a family pet with a loving owner. This was about something far more sinister, kidnapping possibly, or worse. The fake Annie had researched Lucky's story well enough to craft a convincing emotional appeal, but she'd made enough small mistakes to raise suspicions in someone trained to notice inconsistencies. "What's their end game?" Ezra asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Tom thinks it might be connected to those illegal fighting operations that have been cropping up in neighboring states. A dog with Lucky's appearance and proven aggression history would be valuable to the wrong kind of people. Ezra felt his blood turn to ice. The thought of Lucky being forced back into a life of violence and terror after everything he'd overcome was unbearable. But worse was the realization that he'd almost handed the dog over willingly, trusting in legal documents and emotional appeals that were nothing more than elaborate lies. "When are they supposed to arrive?" he asked. "Tomorrow, according to the message they left with the sheriff's office. They want to meet at the cabin to collect their family pet." Lucky seemed to understand that he was the subject of their conversation. His ears were flattened against his skull, and his body radiated the kind of tension Ezra had seen in the early days after the bear attack. The dog's instincts were remarkably acute. He could sense danger even when he didn't understand its specific nature. After Dr. Sullivan left, Ezra spent the afternoon in careful preparation. He cleaned his rifle and counted his ammunition, checked the sight lines from his cabin windows, and reviewed the various approaches to his property. The mountain had always been his ally in seeking solitude. Now it would serve as his fortress, but military tactics were only part of the equation. The emotional weight of the situation pressed down on him like a stone. For months, he and Lucky had been building something beautiful together. Trust, companionship, the quiet contentment of shared routine. Now that peace was threatened by people who saw Lucky not as a living being deserving of love and protection, but as a commodity to be exploited, that evening, as they sat by the fire for what might be their last quiet night together, Ezra found himself speaking aloud the thoughts that had been churning in his mind all day. "I want you to know," he said to Lucky, "that whatever happens tomorrow, these past months have been the best part of my life since I came back from the war. You gave me something I didn't know I was missing. Purpose beyond just surviving." Lucky's tail stirred against the wooden floor. A gentle acknowledgement of words he couldn't fully understand, but whose emotional content was unmistakable. "I also want you to know that I'm not going to let them take you. Whatever it costs, whatever I have to do, you're not going back to a life of fear and pain. That's a promise." The dog moved closer, resting his head on Ezra's knee, with a trust so complete it took Ezra's breath away. This was the same animal who'd spent 8 years driving away every kindness, who'd learned to survive by expecting the worst from everyone he encountered. The transformation wasn't just remarkable, it was sacred, and Ezra would defend it with his life if necessary. Sleep came fitfully that night. Ezra dozed in his chair by the dying fire, rifle across his lap, while Lucky maintained his own vigilant watch by the door. They were like sentries guarding something precious against forces that neither fully understood, but both recognized as deadly. Dawn broke grey and cold over Timber Ridge, with clouds promising rain before the day was through. Ezra had been awake since before sunrise, checking and rechecking his preparations, when he heard the distant sound of a vehicle laboring up the mountain road. Lucky heard it too, his hackles rising as the engine noise grew closer. But instead of the cowering fear he'd shown during Cal's previous visit, the dog positioned himself beside Ezra with the alert readiness of a soldier preparing for battle. The van that emerged from the tree line was exactly what Dr. Sullivan had described: white, commercial-grade, with reinforced rear doors and small ventilation windows that spoke of its intended cargo. 2 people sat in the front seats, a woman with carefully styled blonde hair and a man whose bulk and bearing matched Cal Brennan's description perfectly. They parked 50 yards from the cabin, well outside easy rifle range, but close enough for conversation. The woman emerged first, carrying herself with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way through charm and manipulation. She was perhaps 35, attractive in a calculated way, wearing clothes expensive enough to suggest success but practical enough for mountain travel. The man who joined her was definitely Cal Brennan, though he'd cleaned himself up considerably since his last visit to the mountain. His movements were more controlled, his demeanor more professional, but Ezra could see the same mean-spirited cruelty lurking behind his eyes. "Mr. Boone," the woman called, her voice carrying the false warmth of a practiced liar. "I'm Ann Henderson Williams. We spoke on the phone. I've come for my dog." Ezra stepped onto his porch, rifle held casually but unmistakably ready. Lucky emerged beside him, no longer the cowering creature who'd hidden during Cal's previous visit. The dog's posture was alert but controlled, as if he'd finally learned the difference between justified caution and paralyzing fear. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," Ezra called back. "Ann Henderson died 3 years ago in Sacramento. Want to try a different story?" The woman's facade cracked slightly, her smile becoming more predatory than charming. "I think you're confused, Mr. Boone. I have legal documents proving my identity and my claim to the animal." "Forged documents don't impress me much," Ezra replied. "And neither do men who torture animals for sport. Why don't you and Mr. Brenner there climb back in your van and head down the mountain before this gets unpleasant?" Cal stepped forward, his hand moving toward something concealed beneath his jacket. "Now listen here, you crazy old fool." "I wouldn't," Ezra said quietly, his rifle shifting to a more purposeful angle. "I spent 3 years in Korea, learning how to deal with people who threaten what I care about. The skills haven't faded as much as you might hope." The confrontation hung balanced on a knife's edge. The fake Annie was clearly calculating odds and options, while Cal seemed to be struggling with the unfamiliar experience of facing someone who wasn't intimidated by his brutish presence. Lucky, meanwhile, had begun to growl, not the terrified snarling of his early days, but the deep, purposeful warning of a dog who'd finally learned when to fight and when to flee. He'd chosen his side in this conflict, and he was prepared to defend it with everything he had. "This doesn't have to be difficult," the woman said, her voice losing its false sweetness. "We know you've grown attached to the animal, and we're prepared to compensate you generously for your emotional investment." "The dog's not for sale," Ezra replied. "Not for any price. Everything's for sale, Mr. Boone. It's just a matter of finding the right currency. For some people it's money. For others—" She gestured meaningfully toward Cal, whose hand remained near his concealed weapon. "For others, it's the promise of avoiding unpleasant consequences." The threat was now explicit. Ezra felt his military training take full control, assessing angles and distances, calculating the precise moment when talking would end and shooting would begin. Beside him, Lucky tensed with the same anticipation. 2 warriors preparing to defend the sanctuary they'd built together against forces that would destroy everything they'd worked to create. The storm that had been building all morning chose that moment to break, sending the first heavy drops of rain spattering against the cabin roof. It seemed fitting somehow, as if the mountain itself was preparing for the battle that was about to determine the fate of 2 souls who'd found in each other the peace that had eluded them for so long. "Last chance," Ezra said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd made peace with violence when necessity demanded it. "Walk away now, or face the consequences of your choices." The woman's smile turned cold as winter stone. "I'm afraid we can't do that, Mr. Boone. You see, we've come too far and invested too much to leave empty-handed. But don't worry, this will all be over very soon." Thunder rolled across the ridge like a distant artillery barrage, and Ezra knew that the time for words had passed. Whatever came next would be settled with actions, not arguments. And as the rain began to fall in earnest, washing the mountain clean for whatever would follow, he tightened his grip on the rifle and prepared to fight the most important battle of his life. The first shot came not from Ezra's rifle, but from Cal's concealed pistol, a wild, desperate thing that splintered the cabin's doorframe 6 inches from where Ezra stood. The crack of gunfire echoed across the ridge like thunder, sending birds exploding from the surrounding pines in a chaos of wings and panicked cries. Lucky reacted with the lightning reflexes of a creature who'd learned survival in the hardest possible school. Instead of cowering or fleeing, he launched himself from the porch in a trajectory that carried him directly toward Cal's gun hand. 8 years of suppressed aggression channeled now not toward innocent strangers, but toward someone who truly deserved it. Transformed the dog into a force of nature. Cal's second shot went wild as 90 pounds of determined canine crashed into his chest, sending him stumbling backward into the van's side panel. Lucky's teeth found purchase on the man's wrist, and the pistol clattered across the wet gravel as Cal screamed in pain and surprise. Ezra's rifle spoke next, the .30-06 round punching through the van's front tire with a sound like a thunderclap. The vehicle settled heavily to one side as pressurized air hissed from the ruined wheel. No quick escape now for either of his attackers. The fake Annie had produced her own weapon, a sleek automatic that looked expensive and professional. She fired twice in rapid succession, forcing Ezra to dive behind the cabin's log wall as bullets thudded into the thick timber. Splinters showered down around him, and he could smell the sharp scent of torn wood and gunpowder mixing with the mountain rain. "Lucky," Ezra called, concerned for the dog's safety as much as his own. "Here, boy." But Lucky was fully engaged in his own battle with Cal, who was trying desperately to shake off his four-legged attacker while simultaneously reaching for a knife on his belt. The man's earlier confidence had evaporated in the face of the dog's focused fury. This wasn't the cowering, broken animal he'd tortured years ago. This was something entirely different. Thunder crashed overhead, and the rain intensified, turning the cleared ground around the cabin into a muddy battlefield. Ezra used the noise as cover to move to a better position, circling around the cabin's corner to get a cleaner shot at the woman. His boots slipped on the wet grass, but 15 years of mountain living had taught him how to move silently, even in difficult conditions. The fake Annie was advancing on the cabin, her weapon held in a professional two-handed grip that spoke of training and experience. This wasn't some amateur criminal. She moved with the calculated precision of someone who'd done this kind of work before. "Give it up, Boone," she called over the storm. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. Hand over the dog, and nobody else has to get hurt." "The dog's name is Lucky," Ezra replied from his new position behind a stack of split firewood. "And the only person getting hurt today is going to be anyone who tries to take him." He punctuated his words with another rifle shot, this one aimed at the van's engine block. The heavy slug punched through the hood with a satisfying crash of metal, and steam began pouring from the radiator. Even if they managed to overpower him, his attackers wouldn't be driving down the mountain anytime soon. Lucky's battle with Cal had moved away from the van. The two adversaries circling each other in the muddy clearing like gladiators in some ancient arena. Cal had managed to draw his knife, but the dog's speed and agility made him a difficult target. Every time the man lunged forward, Lucky would dart aside, snapping at exposed flesh before dancing back out of range. "Get that damn dog," the woman screamed at her partner. "I'm not leaving here empty-handed." But Cal was discovering what Ezra had learned months ago. Lucky wasn't just any dog. He was intelligent, determined, and fighting now not from fear but from loyalty. Every feint and strike was calculated, every movement purposeful. The years of surviving on the streets had honed instincts that served him well in this deadly game. Ezra saw his opportunity when the fake Annie moved to get a better angle on Lucky's position. She'd focused so intently on the dog that she'd momentarily forgotten about the man with the rifle. He rose from behind the firewood pile, water streaming from his hair and beard. The .30-06 steady in his experienced hands. "Drop the weapon," he commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who'd given similar orders on Korean battlefields. "Do it now, or I'll drop you where you stand." She spun toward him, her automatic swinging in his direction, and for a frozen instant they faced each other across 20 yards of rain-soaked ground. Time seemed suspended, balanced on the edge of decisions that couldn't be taken back. In that crystalline moment, Ezra saw not just a criminal trying to steal his dog, but all the forces that had conspired to break Lucky's spirit over the years. The casual cruelty, the indifference to suffering, the willingness to treat a living creature as nothing more than property to be bought and sold. Everything he and Lucky had worked to overcome was embodied in this woman's cold, calculating gaze. The choice, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. Ezra's finger tightened on the trigger, but the fake Annie was faster than he'd anticipated. She dove sideways behind the disabled van, just as his shot cracked across the clearing, the bullet sparking off metal where her head had been a heartbeat before. The woman's return fire forced Ezra back behind the firewood, splinters and bark flying as automatic rounds chewed into his cover. She was laying down suppressive fire now, trying to pin him in place while she maneuvered for a better position. Professional tactics that confirmed his suspicions about her background, but she'd made a crucial error in her calculations. In focusing on Ezra as the primary threat, she'd forgotten that Lucky was still engaged with her partner, and the dog's battle with Cal was reaching its own violent conclusion. Cal had managed to corner Lucky against a fallen log, his knife gleaming in the stormlight as he prepared for what he thought would be a killing stroke. But the dog had learned patience along with courage during his months with Ezra. Instead of panicking or retreating, Lucky waited until Cal committed to his attack, then moved with the fluid grace of a creature born to survive. The knife slashed empty air as Lucky twisted aside, then drove forward with the full power of his haunches. His teeth found Cal's throat with surgical precision, and the man's scream of triumph turned to one of terror as he realized his mistake. They went down together in the mud, rolling and thrashing, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Cal had underestimated his opponent one final time, and the price for that miscalculation was absolute. The fake Annie's automatic fire ceased abruptly as she heard her partner's death cry. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by the drumming of rain on metal and wood, she seemed to realize for the first time that her carefully planned operation was collapsing around her. "Cal," she called, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before.
"Cal, answer me!"
Lucky emerged from behind the fallen log, his golden coat darkened with rain and mud, his eyes burning with the righteous fury of someone who'd finally found a worthy target for years of suppressed rage. He looked toward the van where the woman was hiding, and his growl carried clearly across the clearing, not the desperate snarl of a cornered animal, but the controlled warning of a predator who tasted victory and found it satisfying. "Your partner's not going to answer," Ezra called out, moving to a new position while she was distracted. "He made the same mistake you're making, thinking Lucky was still the broken animal you could bully and abuse. This isn't over," she shouted back, but there was desperation in her voice now. "I've got friends who know where I am. If I don't check in, then they'll find 2 bodies in a disabled van," Ezra interrupted, his rifle trained on the vehicle's rear corner where he'd last seen movement. "Your choice how this ends, but it ends here either way." Thunder rolled across the mountain, and in its wake came the distant sound of engines laboring up the steep road. Multiple vehicles, moving fast despite the treacherous conditions. For a moment, Ezra's heart sank. Reinforcements for the criminals would tip the odds beyond any hope of victory. But then Lucky's posture changed, his aggressive stance shifting to one of alert anticipation rather than defensive preparation. The dog's remarkable hearing had identified something in those approaching engines that Ezra's human ears couldn't detect. Sheriff Bradley's patrol car was the first to burst into the clearing, followed closely by Dr. Sullivan's vehicle and 2 state police cruisers. The cavalry had arrived with sirens silent, but emergency lights painting the rain-soaked scene in flashing red and blue. The fake Annie made one last desperate gambit, rising from behind the van with her weapon raised, seeking a hostage or a final shot at the man who'd ruined her plans. But she'd waited too long to make her move. Lucky was already in motion, crossing the muddy ground in powerful bounds that carried him directly into her path. She tried to swing her gun toward the approaching dog, but Lucky had learned the value of surprise from his human companion. He hit her low and hard, driving her backward into the van's side panel with enough force to crack ribs. The automatic flew from her hands, skittering across the wet gravel to land at Sheriff Bradley's feet. "Well," Tom Bradley said, surveying the scene with the calm professionalism of a lawman who'd seen his share of violence. "Looks like we got here just in time for the cleanup." Ezra emerged from behind the firewood pile, his rifle lowered but still ready. Lucky trotted to his side, tail wagging for the first time since the confrontation began. The dog's transformation was complete. From victim to survivor to protector, he'd found in this battle the final piece of his healing. "How did you know to come?" Ezra asked as the state troopers took the fake Annie into custody. Dr. Sullivan called in the cavalry when she spotted their van driving past her clinic this morning, Tom explained. "Recognized the man from your description and figured you might need backup." The woman was conscious but badly shaken as they loaded her into one of the patrol cars. Cal wouldn't be making the trip down the mountain, but his long history of cruelty had finally caught up with him in the most fitting way possible. As the law enforcement vehicles disappeared down the mountain with their prisoner, Ezra and Lucky stood together in the rain, watching the last traces of threat vanish into the storm. The battle was over, but more importantly, so was the war they'd both been fighting for so many years. They were finally, truly free. 6 months later, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Ezra Boone sat on his porch, whittling a piece of pine, while Lucky dozed in the afternoon sunshine. The scene had become as familiar as breathing, but it carried a depth of contentment that neither man nor dog had thought possible in their darker years. The events of that stormy April day had changed everything, though perhaps not in ways that outside observers might have expected. The fake Annie, whose real name turned out to be Rebecca Marshall, a wanted fugitive with connections to illegal animal fighting rings across 3 states, was serving 15 years in the state penitentiary. Her operation had been larger and more sophisticated than anyone had imagined, with Lucky being just one target in a network that spanned hundreds of stolen and abused animals. Cal Brennan's death had been ruled justifiable. Homicide, after a thorough investigation, revealed his long history of animal cruelty and his role in the attempted kidnapping. The coroner's report noted that his injuries were consistent with defensive action by a large dog, and no charges were filed against either Ezra or Lucky for protecting themselves and their home. But the real changes had been quieter, more personal. Lucky's collar, that weathered piece of leather that had carried the name of a dog who'd once brought nothing but good fortune to a loving family, had finally been replaced. Ezra had commissioned a new one from the leather worker in Cedar Falls. Simple brown leather with brass fittings and a single word etched into the metal tag, Lucky. Not because he'd forgotten the dog's tragic past, but because he'd finally understood that carrying grief forever wasn't honoring the dead, it was imprisoning the living. Lucky would always remember the family he'd lost, but he didn't have to spend the rest of his life being defined by that loss. The transformation in their relationship with the town had been equally remarkable. Word of the confrontation had spread quickly through Cedar Falls, but instead of fear or suspicion, the townspeople had responded with something approaching awe. The snarling, aggressive stray had risked his life to protect the mountain hermit, who'd shown him kindness, and in doing so had revealed the truth that a few perceptive souls like Sarah Mitchell had suspected all along beneath the defensive. Aggression had always been a loyal heart, waiting for someone worthy of its devotion. Now, when Ezra made his monthly trips to town for supplies, Lucky walked beside him with the confident bearing of a dog who belonged somewhere with someone. Children who'd once crossed the street to avoid him now asked their parents if they could pet the famous dog who'd helped catch the bad people. Their requests were always granted, because Lucky had learned to distinguish between genuine kindness and potential threat with the wisdom that comes from surviving both. Dr. Margaret Sullivan had become a regular visitor to the mountain cabin, stopping by every few weeks to check on Lucky's health and, Ezra suspected, to enjoy the peaceful atmosphere they'd created together. She told him that Lucky's arthritis was manageable with proper care and exercise, and that the dog's overall condition had improved dramatically since coming to live on Timber Ridge. "You've given him what medicine never could," she'd said during her most recent visit. Purpose, belonging, the knowledge that he's valued for who he is rather than what he can provide. That's the kind of healing that goes deeper than flesh and bone. Sheriff Bradley had also become something of a friend, dropping by when his duties brought him up the mountain road. Tom had confided that the successful resolution of the Lucky situation had led to a broader investigation of animal trafficking in the region, resulting in several arrests and the rescue of dozens of animals from horrific conditions. "You and Lucky started something important that day," Tom had told him. "Sometimes it takes one act of courage to shine a light into dark places that have been hidden too long." But perhaps the most meaningful change had been in Ezra himself. The solitude he'd cultivated for 15 years, necessary as it had been for his own healing after the war, had gradually given way to something richer and more complete. He still treasured the quiet rhythms of mountain life, still found peace in the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the honest work of living close to the land. But he no longer felt the need to hold the world at arm's length. Lucky had taught him that trust, once broken, could be rebuilt with patience and care. That love, when it came later in life, carried a depth and appreciation that youth couldn't match. That sometimes the best partnerships were formed between damaged souls who understood each other's scars and chose to heal together rather than suffer alone. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Ezra set aside his whittling and scratched Lucky behind the ears. The dog's tail thumped against the porch boards, and his eyes, once so watchful and wary, reflected nothing but contentment and trust. "What do you say we check the traps one more time before dinner?" Ezra suggested, reaching for his rifle out of habit rather than necessity. Lucky rose and stretched, his movements still careful with the old injury, but no longer pained. Together, they descended the porch steps and headed toward the forest paths they'd walked together hundreds of times, each step carrying them deeper into a partnership that had saved them both from the prisons of their past. The mountain evening was crisp and clear, with the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called its ancient question to the wilderness, and Lucky's ears pricked forward with interest rather than alarm. He'd learned to distinguish between the sounds that meant danger and those that simply meant life, continuing in all its wild complexity. As they disappeared into the gathering twilight, their footsteps fell into the familiar rhythm of two beings who'd found in each other exactly what they'd been searching for all along. Not just companionship, but redemption. The kind that comes not from forgetting the past, but from choosing to write a better future. One careful step at a time. In the growing darkness behind them, the cabin windows glowed with warm yellow light, a beacon of the peace they'd built together and the promise of many more evenings like this one, when the world felt exactly the right size for a man and his dog, who'd learned that sometimes the best families are the ones we choose for ourselves.